This is the exact same conversation we've been having since I was in high school. I was a junior when the Columbine shooting happened. I was part of the first generation that saw routine school shootings. We have now produced the second school shooting generation in this country. We dare not allow there to be a third. Something is broken, if it is even possible, for the same debate around the same solutions that we all know are the right thing to do. They won't prevent every incident, they won't save every life, but we know what to do, and it has not happened.
Thank you.
This is the emergency broadcast system. This is not a test. Repeat, this is not a test. This is our advice to take the following steps. If exposed, remove from the phone.
Podcast for the curious mind. I don't know what that means.
Podcasting live from a German-made microphone high atop Sioux Nation. I am Corey here with Clemens on Sunday morning. How you doing, bud?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. We have Tim Tate with us today. Interview with Tim Tate. Yep. I think it's like 3:00 his time over there in the UK. So, but he is a investigative journalist. And did you watch that documentary that had been uploaded onto YouTube, Conspiracy of Silence?
Yes.
So he's the one that put that all together. So I'm just excited to get his take, because we've been down a dark little rabbit hole last couple of days. It'd be nice to get a different perspective for sure.
So maybe a different feel on things, on how everything happened.
Yeah,
like his perspective on it anyway.
Yeah. So, well, without any further ado, Tim Tate. How's it going, sir?
It's going very well, thank you. How are you?
Oh, we are thrilled to have you on this show with us, Tim. Thanks so much for coming on, especially on short notice. We've been going down. I just discovered this story, the Franklin cover-up, literally 2 weeks ago. Which it feels weird saying that, because I was raised in the Midwest, no more than 2-3 hours from Omaha my entire life, and I have never heard this story whatsoever. And it was only when we did an episode on Columbine that I just accidentally discovered John DeCamp on a radio interview, and he had mentioned something along the lines of this Franklin cover-up that he had been a part of, along with other cases. And so, of course, I went down my YouTube wormhole and started typing in Franklin cover-up, and I came across Conspiracy of Silence, amongst a lot of other things. But, the fact of, just how that video starts, made me want to reach out to you. So thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
How long has it been since you did your work on what had happened in Omaha?
30 years.
Wow.
30 years ago.
Yeah. I was excuse me, I was a youngish then producer for British television, the best documentary production company in the world, I think, at the time. And in 1993, we started making Conspiracy of Silence. And so that is 30 years ago. It's in fact almost to the day 30 years ago since we first went to Nebraska, to Lincoln, and to Omaha.
I'm so sorry your experience of the United States had to be at Nebraska.
I have to say, I like Nebraska. I've worked in the US for the best part of 40-something years, and I worked there most years. And I love the US. And actually, I liked Nebraska. I love the Midwest.
If you just come to South Dakota, it would have been 10 times better. It would have blown you.
I've never been to South Dakota, I'm afraid.
No, that's where I'm at. I'm in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, not too far away. What company were you working for, or was it your company? Or
No. You have to forgive me to acquaint your listeners, viewers, with a brief history of how British television worked then. There were then 4 channels. The BBC had 2 channels, and there were 2 commercial television stations, television networks. One of them was called ITV, Independent Television, and it was a network of 15 regional companies, each having the license to broadcast in their area, and which came together to form the network. So that some programs, particularly in peak time, were networked. And the company I worked for, Yorkshire Television, was one of those 15 franchise holders. It produced an enormous amount of television for the network, but it was most famous, I think, for producing high-end documentaries. And as I said, it's in my experience, and I was in the business for a long time, it was the best place in the world to make serious films. And the main series we made for ITV, Channel 3, the main commercial network, was something called First Tuesday, and it had, if you viewers look it up, you'll see First Tuesday won awards around the globe for much more than a decade. Very good, very serious films. However, the British government, in its wisdom, decided to change the rules for commercial television. And in 1993, just as I finished a big film for First Tuesday, the rules changed, the whole network changed, and the way it was organized changed, and First Tuesday as a series was ended. However, Yorkshire Television did a deal with the Discovery Channel, Discovery US and Discovery Europe, and Discovery bought First Tuesday as a brand. They bought us, essentially, to make what was initially slated to be 13 one-hour films for transmission on the Discovery Network. And the first film it commissioned was mine, was Conspiracy of Silence. We sat in a pitching meeting with the executives from Discovery, and I said, I have this story. This is what's been sent to me from a freelance journalist I've worked with in LA. It's about the abuse and exploitation of young people, both in Nebraska and centering on Boys Town, America's most celebrated, famous charity, and then spreading out so that it reached the edges of the White House.
Had you done episodes like or shows like this before, dealing with corruption with children, or was this the first time you were?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, I'd made a number of films, and indeed at that point written a couple of, I can't remember, it was 2 or 3 books dealing with investigating the appalling things that adults do to children. And so that's one of the reasons why this freelance in LA thought of me. He said he'd been working on the story. Was I interested? Well, yeah. So we pitched it to Discovery, and I can remember word for word what the Discovery commissioning executive said when we pitched it to her. She said, it's got politics, it's got pedophilia, it's got everything. And they commissioned it on the spot.
So this wasn't like, because I was 5 in 93, and I grew up through the Catholic expose of abuse of children, and so it was a pretty, it got to be a pretty common calling card, both on the political level and on the social level. But I was reading the preface to John DeCamp's book, and he was saying, back in the early 90s, late 80s, this was very hush hush, didn't really want to get discussed about it. Was that your take on the matter? Did you feel like this was sort of a one of those taboo subjects that would
Child sexual exploitation.
yeah.
Oddly, less so in the US than in the UK. Generally, as a rough rule of thumb, the US nationally was then probably 7 or 8 years ahead in terms of investigative effort of where we were in the UK. In the UK, I mean, there was virtually no serious law enforcement investigative effort going on. At least in the US, the FBI, for what that was worth, the US Customs had a specialist unit, so did the US Postals, and were doing very, very good work, particularly in dealing with and investigating what we now call indecent images of children, what was then called child pornography. So I think John was right in that there was still and still is, a reaction, a visceral reaction amongst people. Well, we don't want to know about that. But it was less. That Britain was much, much worse than the US at that point.
So were you surprised Discovery that was the piece they wanted to run with right off the bat?
So it's a difficult answer because you never know as a producer or a director what television broadcasters, networks want. I mean, frankly, they don't know. If they knew, they wouldn't be commissioning editors.
What so you get the go ahead from Discovery. Now, is that when you start the process of making your film, going out to Omaha, or had you already compiled it at that point?
We'd been out to my colleague, Nick Gray, who was the director on the film. I was the producer. He had been to meet John DeCamp, I think, before we sat down with Discovery. That would certainly make sense. And John had assured him, yes, I can help you. I will definitely want to help make this film because I think it's an important film to make. But once Discovery gave us the green light, and indeed began paying the money for the film and for what it's worth, the budget, I think, from memory, was around $250,000, which in 1993 was no small change. We flew out, Nick and I flew out to Nebraska, to Lincoln, and I particularly set about meeting all the key figures in the story and, crucially, seeing how I could get access to an entire roomful of documents. And those documents had been compiled by the Nebraska State Legislature, which had an investigation, and also by a grand jury. And all of these files were locked away, and I managed to get access to them and copied every last page, and also the videos and audio tapes which had gone with them. And doing that showed me that what the complainants were saying was factual. There was documentary evidence to support their allegations, and that's vital, because without that, we wouldn't have made the film.
Did you go into it with the mindset that there was probably that this was going to end up as you found out through the documentation, or was this sort of like, hey, maybe this could be a whole made up thing? Because according to the press here, it was an elaborate hoax.
Yeah, you have to be careful with that phrase. That was a quote from from memory, a prosecutor in one of the multitudinous cases that went on. It was picked up, sure, by some newspapers. I always go into a project like that with an open mind. People tell you stories. And again, I don't know how much your readers know, but your viewers know about the story. What was being said, there was a group of 3 particularly young people who said, we were exploited by a group of rich and powerful, sexually exploited by a group of rich and powerful men in Omaha. And this was part of a child sexual abuse ring. Child, difficult word in this context. What you're looking at is 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds. And that they had some of the other victims in this had been found recruited from Boys Town. And indeed, one of the young people, the complainant, said he had been sent to bring people out from Boys Town to be victimized by this group. And that these 3 young people also said that they were transported across the country, primarily to Washington, D.C., where they were provided as sexual entertainment to rich and powerful people in politics and business in Washington, D.C. Those were the allegations. Where I began was with those 3 complainants and with John DeCamp, who was the lawyer for them, or for 2 of them, and with some of the state legislatures, the state senators, who had been involved in commissioning an investigation which had essentially ended when the lead investigator, the official investigator, a private investigator called Gary Caradori, had died in somewhat mysterious circumstances. I started there, and what I found in that roomful of documents, closed roomful of documents, was that Caradori had found not just corroborating evidence for those 3 young people, but that he had found previous complainants from Boys Town who complained about exactly the same group of sexual exploiters and exactly the same treatment. And that first tranche, if you like, of complainants had emerged about 3 or 4 years, maybe 5, before the second tranche.
The Boys Town complaints and getting access, because I think it was Julie Waters who had gone over there and taken some notes from the Webbs, the Kimberly and Nellie Webb had made some allegations they had met boys from Boys Town at these parties. And I think John DeCamp mentions her notes that she mentions that was, it was credible evidence at these sex parties they had kids from Boys Town.
That much of that is secondhand evidence. What I always look for is primary source evidence, firsthand. And what Gary Caradori, the investigator who died, had done was record interviews with all or as many of these complainants, victims, as he could find. And Gary Caradori was a bloody good investigator. He was meticulous. And this room full of documents contained the transcripts of those interviews, the videotapes in many cases of those interviews, and all of this had been provided to the state legislature because Caradori was hired by them to carry out this investigation. So what I was looking at was primary source evidence.
So you went to the people you could talk to first. What was your feeling of John DeCamp when you first met him?
I liked John and respected John a great deal. Do I think he got everything right? No, I don't. I think his book it's not what you could call forensic. John had a huge heart and a huge compassion for these young people, and he set out to do what he could, the best he could, to get some kind of justice for them, because everything that had happened prior to John getting involved and thereafter was that their complaints had been covered up.
Well, and not just covered up, but sentenced to 25 years. And
Yeah, one of the second tranche, if that's what we're going to call them, of complainants was a young woman called Alicia Owen. There were three main complainants in this second tranche: Paul Benassi, Troy Bonner, and Alicia Owen. And Alicia had named several people who she said had abused her, sexually abused her. She was taken to court, and she was charged and convicted in state court, essentially of making that up, of that being false. And she was sentenced, as you say, to, I think from memory, between 9 and 25 years for doing that. Now, my first reaction when I saw that sentence is that is extraordinary. I mean, that's a huge, huge sentence, even if you assume that she had been making it up, and the reverse is true.
Yeah, the charge or the amount of time makes you feel like they're not charging the crime, that they're charging the person, and that's what it.
They were doing both, but they had a slight problem, or they should have had a slight problem with charging the crime. Alicia was asked on the stand, or instructed on the stand when she was giving evidence, to name her abusers, and that's what she did, and that's essentially what she was convicted of doing wrong. The problem with that is that the law in Nebraska says that she had to name her abusers. How do I know that? Well, because John DeCamp wrote that law. He was a state senator and wrote that law, and it was accepted as it became law in Nebraska. So essentially, this huge sentence was for a crime which didn't exist.
So you call Boys Town first?
No, the first thing I did was go to try and find the complainants. So Paul Benassi, I spent a long time with. I spent some time with Alicia Owen, and it quickly became apparent to me, and I think anybody else who looked at this, that the key to this, the key to understanding what had gone on, what had happened, and then how it had been covered up, was the third complainant, this young man, Troy Bonner. Troy had made statements, sworn statements, naming the men who had sexually exploited him and confirming Paul Benassi's story of exploitation and Alicia Owen's story of exploitation, confirming it from having witnessed it. Troy had then been induced to recant his testimony. And that's why he was, in my view, crucial. Because if he stood by that recantation, then the story or the allegations become a little less credible, don't they? So I went to find Troy, and it took a while, and it took a much longer amount of time to gain Troy's trust. Troy, at that point, was two things. The first is that he was very seriously and heavily addicted to drugs. his version is that he had been fed those drugs at parties, and that's how his addiction had started. I have no way of saying whether that's correct or not, but he was a drug addict, and I know that because I witnessed him hunting for supplies.
How much time did you spend with Troy?
Oh, weeks and weeks and weeks. The second thing you need to know about Troy at that point is that he was absolutely terrified. He was terrified, and this is the story he told me. I was threatened by the FBI, amongst other people, to induce me to recant my evidence. And they threatened me that if I didn't, they would arrest me, send me to jail, and I was going to die in jail.
This is while you're in Omaha doing the discovery.
And my argument, I suppose, to Troy was, well, first of all, you need to tell me the truth now. And he said very plainly, the truth is what I said originally was correct. The abuse happened, the exploitation happened. What happened to me, what happened to Alicia, and what happened to Paul, and what I said about that in my original statements, it was absolutely accurate. It was my recantation of that, which was forced on me and which was a lie. Okay. I said, well, will you now come clean? Will you now tell your story fully? He said, well, I can't, because if I do, they're going to send me to prison. And I, to my regret, persuaded him that he should recant his recantation, if you want to put it that way. And my argument was very simple. I said, once you go public and tell the truth once and for all on film, and it's broadcast on Discovery all across the US and Europe, there is no mileage in harassing you. The cat's out of the bag. And I persuaded him on that basis that he would be safer because the film was going to be broadcast. And that's what he did. It took weeks, if not months, to get to that point. And I spent time with his family, getting to know them and earning their trust. And I said, you're going to be safer if you speak the truth now, because it's going to be broadcast. And after that, there's no point in going after you.
You with his parents, his parents,
his mother and his mother and his sister and his brother. I spent a deal of time with them.
What was like, because that was something that never really got discussed in the book or in the documentary, but to have that going on to your child, like what was going on in the household to allow that?
It was heartrending. I liked his mother, Laurie, very much indeed. She was dealing with a young family. Troy, I think, from memory, was the eldest. And his siblings, his younger brother and his younger sister, I mean, they, as to the best of my recollection, they worshipped Troy. I mean, he was their big brother. Yeah, he was a complete mess. But when he wasn't utterly strung out, I witnessed them together and spent time with them together. He loved his brother and his sister and his mother, and they adored him. The dynamics of that, which I know are played out in families all across the world every day, but they're heartrending to witness.
Do you I mean, because his exploitation started quite young too as well, didn't it?
I'm dredging my memory. 30 years. I think it's mid-teens from memory, 14, 15, something like that.
So and you got him, you spent a couple of weeks. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, much more. I persuaded Troy to tell the truth. And you always have a doubt in your mind. If you don't, you shouldn't be doing my job. That really the FBI lent on you. Why would it do that? And then I came across a recording a tape recording which Gary Caradori had obtained. And it was a tape recording of a phone call that the FBI had set up. And the FBI had hauled Troy into the local FBI office in Omaha and got him to phone Alicia Owen, who was then being held on remand in prison. And the purpose of the phone call was for Troy to tell Alicia, yeah, you know we made all this up. You know it's time, we've got to tell the truth. And Alicia's reaction is priceless. She says, what are you talking about? And the reason it's so significant, and the reason I know it's an FBI phone call, an FBI taped phone call, is because the FBI agent introduces himself at the start of the recording and says, this is Agent so-and-so. This recording is of Troy Bonner calling Alicia Owen, and there's a date. So I knew it was, this is cast iron proof of what Troy was talking about of the FBI putting pressure on him to knock the whole story down.
Well, and there's a part in that recording too where she's like, "What? Tell me what I said that wasn't true."
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, and you can hear him break at that point. And he's like, "Everything was true. Everything he said was true." And then, then he has to resort back to trying to get her to admit it was a lie.
Yeah,
but it's hard.
He's got an FBI agent sitting on his shoulder.
Yeah. So he's still. And do you know when that call was recorded? Was that 89, 90? It was right before the grand jury, wasn't it?
I did know when that was recorded at 30 years distance. I'm sorry, I can't tell you.
Watch the Conspiracy of Silence. It'll tell you there. I think John DeCamp is the one that presses the play button on that.
I mean, in the film we played it because when I found the tape, I remember saying to you, Nick, my colleague, dear God, this is awful. And we decided that because John didn't know anything about it. So we played it to John and filmed John listening to it. And his reaction is just the same as everybody else's who heard it. It's just awful.
How many of you were down in Omaha for that period of time?
There was me and Nick. I was the producer. Nick was the director. There was a researcher. And then the film crew joined us. And in those days, we shot everything on film, on 16mm film. So there was a cameraman, assistant cameraman, sound recordist, PA. I'm trying to remember if there's anyone. Oh, no, I don't think it was a grip. It was a big enough team. And we were holed up in Nebraska in Omaha, Lincoln and Omaha for weeks upon weeks making this.
Did you ever try to... Were you ever curious as to like Larry King or the chief of police? Or talking to any of those people, or were they just trying to distance themselves as much as possible?
Well, King, I'm going from memory. King was in prison at that point. Larry King, who was allegedly the spider at the center of this exploitation ring. King was a very prominent Republican. He was in the 80s, the late 80s and early 90s. He was the great black hope of the Republican Party. And he'd used the credit union in Omaha as a vehicle to worm his way into Boys Town and to business and political circles, both in Nebraska and across the country. But he was convicted of what amounts to fraud and was serving time at the point where we were making the film. So there was no way I was going to get to Larry King. All the other people, the police chief, the newspaper columnist, the very rich businessman, Yeah, of course, it's standard practice it's not just standard practice, it's required that we contacted them, we tried to persuade them to talk to us, we tried to get them to answer the questions. And in fact, I think it's in the film. One of them, I doorstepped and said, come on, tell me the truth. And he just wouldn't talk. So, yeah, of course we did.
Tony, now after you had spent time with Tony and then got him to get on film,
Troy, you mean?
Or Troy, I'm sorry, Troy, yes. Once you got Troy to get on film, like what was the next step? Did you go to Alicia Owens or
Alicia was behind bars at that point on remand. We had one meeting with her, and a formal meeting, if you like, and she said, "I can't take part in the film. I can't give you an interview because I'm appealing against my sentence, and it's not going to do me any favors." And I think she was right. I should say Alicia got out. John de Camp was representing her, as he was Benassi and Troy at that point. And we filmed Troy, we filmed Benassi, we filmed the state senator, Lauren Schmidt, a very, very brave man who had backed the investigation and had backed these complainants. We filmed Gary Dory's family. We filmed the State Child Protection Board woman who had quit because after Gary's death, she said, "That's it." You'll see her talking about this on film. She said, once he died, I knew it just wasn't safe. We filmed all of these people, and then we went to DC and filmed there. And we ended up with a very large quantity of rushes, of 16mm film rushes, and brought it back to England, to where we began assembling it. And at each point in this process, we kept Discovery informed. We said, this is what we've got. This is the story so far. This is the evidence. And I also shipped back copies of those roomful of documents because under our contract with Discovery, we had legal responsibility. It was my job as producer to clear this through lawyers so that, crudely, for essentially libel insurance purposes, we had a clean bill of health from lawyers in the UK, and English libel law is the most draconian in the Western world, but also a top set of libel lawyers in New York for the US. It was my job to clear that, and that's why I needed all these documents. So I shipped all of these copies back. It was an entire wall in our office filled with these documents. And while I was working through that, working on the script, Nick, my colleague, was in the edit suite. Edit suites in those days, I know, we all know now, we all do it on computer. We cut films on computer. It's quick. In those days, no, we're dealing with 16mm film. You're talking about a huge cast iron machine called a Steenbeck, which runs reels of film and runs separate magnetic reels of audio tape. And we began putting together what's called, in the trade, a rough cut. And we made that rough cut.
And the rough cut is what we see on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And we delivered that rough cut. And the normal process is you take the rough cut to the broadcaster, the network, in this case, Discovery. And they'd say, well, yeah, but have you thought about this? Maybe that. Maybe could you do that? Could you change the script there? Can you? And that's normal. That's the normal process. And you then take that back and you spend another few weeks fine cutting. And when you finish the fine cut, normally, you show the fine cut to them and they sign off or ask for a couple more tweaks. And then, because this is on film, it goes to something called neg cutting, which is the final stage, and it produces a beautifully clean, fully finished film. We never got there. We showed the rough cut to Discovery. My colleague, Nick, showed it to them. I was in the edit suite, and I remember him ringing me. And he said, they've cancelled the film. They've
What was your gut feeling when you heard that?
It's like a punch in the gut. My instinctive reaction, apart from why, what the hell's gone wrong, what's the reason they're giving, and I'll come back to that in a second. My instinctive reaction was, oh God, I promised Troy that he'd be safe because the film was going to be broadcast. The reason Discovery gave to Nick, or so Nick relayed to me, and Nick's a very good and experienced and honourable man, was, and I quote, "We seem to have gotten into an investigative area which is inconsistent with Discovery's mission statement." End quotes, period.
They should have known that, like, while you've been updating them this whole time, though. Like, because they
They
knew
knew
what the
it.
film was about, like, throughout this whole time, right?
They knew it from the moment I pitched it. Remember their reaction?
Yeah.
It's got politics, it's got pedophilia, it's got everything. They
Yeah.
knew it at each stage because we kept them updated at each stage of the research, of the filming, and then during the edit. They knew this all the way through. But they were intransigent. They just said, no, we're not having it.
What's their mission statement? What's their mission statement? Like,
Or who got to them is what I'm thinking.
well, yeah, that's a whole separate conversation. But the deal that they insisted on was that they handed everything, the rights to everything, every last millimeter of film, every last piece of audio tape, every last piece of paper, were all handed back to Yorkshire Television, the production company. And the deal was, you can sell it to somebody else. You can finish this film, sell it to somebody else and I'm sorry, we will pay you. They paid the $250,000. The sole condition was that we never associate Discovery with the production.
has that happened in other areas where, I mean, not even controversial, but just like a studio buys an idea and then they're like, it's not going to work, but we're going to pay you back for everything that we promised? Is that normal?
Well, it never happened to me before.
You hadn't heard it happen to any of your other colleagues either, have you? Like along those lines?
I mean, yeah, no. There's a caveat to that. I made other films about child sexual exploitation after that for British television, and child sexual abuse and exploitation is an incredibly emotive and sensitive subject. And I had in two other films, I had not quite as extreme problems, but similar problems with both Yorkshire Television and also then with one of the networks saying, oh, no, we shouldn't do this. We've changed our mind. And it didn't make any difference. The films went out and indeed, in one case, won an award, a big major award. But this was the first time I had a major international network saying, we've got cold feet and you can have everything back. We'll pay you, just never mention our name in connection with this production. So two things happened after that. I should say I cleared the film, the rough cut of the film, with the lawyers in London and in New York. I got completely clean legal bill of health.
So that was already known and good to go. That the
Oh yeah,
lawyer said,
yeah.
Because
Script had been cleared. The visual of the film had been cleared. Everything had been cleared. The lawyers had cleared this and said, "You're fine. This is perfectly legally sound." But once Discovery pulled out, work on taking the rough cut to what should have been fine cut stopped. I mean, literally, the cutting room was shuttered.
just overdone.
And that was that. I was very quickly assigned to another film, but before that, I had to try and get in touch with everyone who had taken part and warn them that this is, I should say, the film was known about. The film was in the listings magazines in the States. The main listing magazines at the time showed, there you go, Discovery on this date, conspiracy of silence at whatever time. It was there. It was in the listings. So I had to try and track everyone down. And John was obviously first port of call, and Benassi, Alicia, Lauren Schmidt, Carol Stitt, the Caradoris. The one person I could not find was Troy Bonner. Troy disappeared.
Have you ever heard from him again, or?
Troy died, I think from memory, 8 or 9 years later. Somewhere on the other side of the country. But from the moment that word got back to Nebraska that the film was cancelled and was not going to be broadcast, Troy disappeared. And I could never find him. I never spoke to him again. I wish I could have done.
Why does that one? I mean, why does that one stick with you the most? Do you feel?
Because Troy died, and because I made a promise. I made a promise. I said you'll be safe, and he wasn't.
It's such a horrible thing that happened over there, and then the after effects of that are lifelong, and it's amazing how many people it affects. What was John's reaction? What was Lauren's reaction when you called them and told them that they were canceling the show?
I'm trying to remember Lauren's reaction. I mean, Lauren, in my experience, was an incredibly decent, good, honourable man. And he had already suffered grievously, as they all had. Anyone who took this up found themselves targeted, maybe, but certainly on the wrong end of some very nasty accusations and publicity. My vague memory of Lauren's reaction was just the equivalent of head in hands. Here we go again. The investigation which he'd helped set up for the state legislature had ended, had been cancelled essentially. Gary Caradori had died. There had been these ludicrous grand juries and court cases which had seen essentially the alleged victims punished, not the abusers. I think for Lauren, from memory, it was just, again, John's reaction was different. John was a fighter, quite literally a fighter. He'd been in the CIA or CIA program during Vietnam, and John was a fighter, but he was also someone who was prone to see a possible explanation and to then extrapolate that into, well, that's a fact. No, John, it's a possible explanation, not a fact. But John
He seemed like
whether
he was emotional, like I mean, not
oh,
in a
John
bad
was an
way.
incredibly emotional man, but I don't think that's a bad thing. John was heart on his sleeve, and a good man, though with faults, I guess. Who isn't? Who doesn't have faults? And John, from there on, I mean, and I stayed in touch with John for many years. It began spinning out of control of the known facts into wider theories about what lay behind not just the cancelling of the film, but also the exploitation ring itself. And I know there are threads on the internet. I know there are any number of theories about both of those things. All I can tell you, and through you, your viewers, is what we put on screen in that rough cut, what you see in that rough cut version of Conspiracy of Silence was what I could prove. And I should say, I have no idea how that film ended up on the internet. It was
Really?
it was in the late 90s. Someone called me or emailed me and said, "Did you know Conspiracy of Silence is on YouTube?" And what? Now, there were about, I don't know, half a dozen VHS copies of that film. And the reason there was only so few was that it was an incredibly cumbersome, clumsy process to transfer 16mm film with separate sound onto VHS in those days. So there weren't oodles of these tapes hanging around, and I have no idea how someone got hold of that and posted it on the internet. What I do know is two things. Firstly, as someone else said to me, it is the most widely viewed film that has never been broadcast officially in, as far as I'm aware, in anyone's history. And secondly, a lot of the conspiracy theories which have grown up around it have no basis in any fact that I saw.
I think it's a beautiful thing the internet has done for us, is over these areas that have been hidden that no one would have ever have seen, or even if it had aired in 93, who knows how quickly it would have been tamped down. But now it's it's available for anyone to watch for free, and they easy access. And I mean, you have been studying, or not studying, but investigating child exploitation for quite some time, and
30 odd years.
yeah. And I mean, it has to be, there has to be some reward to seeing, like the Epstein Island thing blowing up, and these people that are involved in some of this exploitation, that are using their power to gain access, being exposed more so than before.
I think the Me Too movement is, it's a very positive step forward, not just for young people and children, but for women and for the creative industries. We've seen Harvey Weinstein. We've seen that whole thing. It has, if you look at it with a positive spin, if you like, it's come out of the closet. It's now something that's talked about. Unfortunately, I think that's too positive a spin on it. Yes, sometimes it does, but it's rare. And what tends to make the difference is the difference between something getting publicized and talked about and something remaining hidden or brushed under the carpet. What makes the difference is celebrity. And I think that's incredibly dangerous. Child sexual exploitation, child sexual abuse takes place day in, day out, the world over. And the vast, vast, vast majority takes place within extended families. And it takes place in utterly banal settings between people who are otherwise unremarkable in any other way. The victims of that are never going to have their Me Too moment because neither they nor their abusers, alleged abusers, are celebrities. And that's bad enough, but at the same time, you've had an explosion in the ease with which abusers and exploiters can gain access to children and young people and exploit them. When we made Conspiracy of Silence, and in fact, when I started making films and writing books about this in the mid to late 80s, video cameras with big clunky tapes and batteries that lasted 5 minutes were a new invention. And they were just beginning to revolutionize it. Again, 93, there was no World Wide Web in 1993. The web, the internet, digital technology, digital cameras, everyone's got a camera on their phone now. It has fueled an explosion in child sexual exploitation. And it's made it even more transnational, even more global than it was before. So some man is sitting somewhere in, I don't know, Nebraska, Iowa, and directing the sexual abuse of children in the Philippines or in Vietnam. You know, it's the Me Too movement, and that understanding and that realization, I think, is positive, but it's just the tiniest pixel of what is a pandemic in child sexual exploitation.
Yeah, it really hit me when you said that, a lot of these kids won't have their Me Too movement because there's no celebrities. And you're exactly right, because, uh, you know, it's happening in extended families. But, I kind of take like, I can't help but see myself with some of these, like Troy Bonner, because I myself was a foster kid. So, hearing some of these kids' stories is just it's heartbreaking for me, because these kids were taken from their families, from these individuals of power, and that society trusts, and then they're put in this ring. And so, like, from the kids' perspective, they didn't do anything. They're subject to the situation all the way through, like, from it starting to it ending, per se, or if it ends, really. And so they're ripped away from their families, and then they're forced into these situations, and then they're just telling people, like, hey, this is what happened. And then they're being told that they're wrong because of it. So everything about them that they're being told is wrong, and that it breaks my heart.
Oh, amen. You, there's a test I guess I would apply, which is, we're 30 years on from Conspiracy of Silence, from Nick Gray and I going to Nebraska and trying to tell people what allegedly had happened. And the test is, would it happen again? would that same situation happen again, or have we learnt enough? Has the world changed enough? And I think from where I sit, the answer is no. It's not just would happen again, but I'm sure it does happen
They
again.
learned how to cover it up better. Is what happened.
Well, that is where we start getting into politics.
It's my opinion. Yeah,
No,
of
it's
course. Yeah.
my opinion too. It's where we start getting into politics with a small p. Child sexual exploitation should not be a political, in the pejorative sense of the word, in my view, issue. Unfortunately, it has become one. It's become adopted by those on, I'm putting this gently, the religious right as a new crusade. And you could say, well, whoopee, that's great. And, unfortunately, they're not forensic investigators. They're not terribly careful. That leads to the nonsense of QAnon and Pizzagate and the rest. But equally, it causes a backlash. And every time, I've seen this for 40 years, every time that we take one step forward in the understanding, the public understanding and exposure of the nature and extent of child sexual exploitation, there is a public backlash, and it's a backlash fueled by appallingly bad reporting and people's visceral instincts. And their visceral instincts are saying, I don't know about this. It's become politicized in a way that it shouldn't have been. And that ultimately does not help the victims.
One other thing I'm interested in with, you talked about some of these kids receiving some backlash or being told, like, recant your stories and things, but did you guys or anybody that worked for you like experienced any backlash from
Well, other than
local
having our
people?
film cancelled.
Yeah, like while you were in Nebraska and things.
I've been asked that before, and the normal question is, did you or the crew feel threatened at any point? The only time, and I have no means of proving this, that we felt threatened or felt worried was we believed we were being followed at one point. And that happened. It appeared to be very obvious. It wasn't what you could call subtle. It was the same car appearing beside us, behind us, in the same locations across several days. That happened after I pushed the FBI to, because I said to you, obviously called the FBI and said, we want to talk to you. We want to hear your side of the story. That is the closest I felt to being threatened. Quite a strong word, but I can't give a better one at this point. But we got to go home. I got to go back to England. I got to go back to my kids and my family, and Troy didn't, and the others didn't get much out of it, if at all.
30 years, later, and you're still doing. Are you still doing investigative journalism then?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I retired from television in 2016. Though I still do some television on a consultancy basis. I write books. I've just delivered my 19th book to my publishers, and I do that largely because I like writing, and I like writing books, and I like digging around and being a troublemaker. I plead guilty to that, but also because book publishing is pretty much the last place you can do this now in Britain. The television networks don't want serious investigative journalism. Not much. They might, take a little bit here, a little bit there, just to burnish their credentials every once in a while. But the industry I was lucky enough to work in for 30 odd years, where we wanted to do this, we wanted to tell difficult stories, we wanted to open people's eyes, and we were encouraged to do that and supported in doing that. That's gone. I don't know what it's like in the States now, but
Oh, it's very similar. It's very similar.
you know,
The
that
transition to pop politics is, you
Mhm.
know, what I call it is
Yeah, I
much
mean, it's
easier, less work, and then, you know, as
and
long as
cheaper.
yeah.
It's very it's really cheap to put three people in a studio together. Hello, there's three people in a studio together. Um,
Yes.
it's
Following the model.
there you go. It's a lot cheaper to do that than put a film crew on the road for 2 months.
Yeah. When did you start to see this transition
Oh,
to
1994. That's when it started. You know, it didn't. Things don't die immediately. There's no quick death, but serious investigative journalism on television in the UK, again, I can't speak to the US, died a slow, lingering death until by really 2008, 2009, it was gone. At that point, I started making films for Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera's English network, which is broadcast globally, and they still had then a commitment to serious investigative journalism. There was no money to make them, but we made them anyway. But it was an outlier. It was a last bastion of investigative journalism. And I know this because I'd made films for all the networks in the UK before that, all of them. And I had a story which I pitched to all of the main networks, BBC, Channel 4, Channel 3, about Boeing and about its allegations that it had put into the sky 1,800 passenger planes, which it knew to be defective. And I had chapter and verse. I had the whistleblowers. I had another room full of documents, Boeing's own documents. Not one of the main networks in the UK would go near this. Al Jazeera did, and we made the film. And it's
is that the 727 or
737.
yes?
It's a film. You can view it on Al Jazeera and indeed on my website. I think it's called "On a Wing and a Prayer." But I mean, the reaction of one of the main commissioning editors at the main networks, the main British networks, was, you can't go around saying things like that about a well-respected international company. I said, well, you can if you have the documents, if you have the evidence, if you have chapter and verse, their own documents which show this is true, then sure you can, and sure you should. But no, it's easier and cheaper to make Love Island or Say Yes to the Dress.
Do you feel though? I mean, because there's definitely a need among people to, you know, I mean, look at our, you know, little podcast here, you know, and we come across this Franklin cover up, but you know, in my research of listening to other people talk about this and, you know, listening to you on other interviews, you know, it has this, you know, between this type of topic and true crime, like there's definitely a market. It's just there's no real direction as far as when it comes to researching these projects, you know, because it's
Well,
not, journalism isn't really taught anymore.
I don't know about whether it's taught in the US. I mean, I do know how badly it's taught in the UK, and yet how extensively it's taught in the UK. I mean, it's a huge irony. We have more journalism courses and media studies courses at universities than ever before. And yet, and I know this because I've been in these the teaching sessions with them, what's being taught is drivel. I think there's a fundamental problem for society. Once trusted outposts, the main television networks in the US, be that ABC, CBS, NBC, Discovery, once they stop doing their job, and our job is to tell the best version of the truth that we can, and to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. Once we stop doing that, in a world where it's so easy for someone to hop onto YouTube or Twitter or Rumble and record their own take on it, not having done any research, any original research, you get an echo chamber of conspiracy theories. And what we are doing is creating, because there is no quality control, there is no fact checking on that Wild West, and because the traditional legacy media have largely stopped doing this, people still want to know, they still want to believe and want to find out things, but who do you go to? You can't go to whoever the equivalent of Walter Cronkite is today and say, I know I can trust that, because you can't. They don't do it. And so you end up, as you said at the beginning, going down a rabbit hole. And it's incredibly dangerous.
Well, Tim, we appreciate you so much for coming on and telling us everything that you did in this process. And
it's kind of you to invite me in to listen. I'm sorry it ain't more cheerful, but I don't do cheerful.
No, we just appreciate your truth. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
You're welcome.
Really appreciate it.
Good luck with it.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your evening.
And you. Take care.
Yes, thank you.
That was Tim Tate.
Wow.
Joining us from the UK.
He's an amazing guy for doing the work that he does. Like, it's, man, my hat goes off to him. Like, he's a warrior.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Like I get it. We do a podcast. And it's it's just a small little piece, and we love all our small little listeners that listen in on us too.
Yes,
but it's fascinating to hear someone who had the means, who had the chance to meet these people face to face, and I mean, his gut didn't say that they were lying. So I think in the end, there's a lot of truth to what happened in
I know. It made me think, like, May was in the back of was on my shoulder on this episode when he, because all I could hear is like, oh, we should look at where the money went, because with his documentary getting shut down, it's like, to me, it almost sounded like somebody got, like, I don't want to say Discovery got paid off, but money usually talks.
Like yeah.
It has that it has that direct feel, like, oh, who got
we
paid?
We don't want to upset you. We know you already paid for this, so we're gonna pay you back, plus give you a little extra.
Yeah, and not to mention, like, they knew what this was about, like, from the beginning. Like, that's what amazes me is, like, they knew why they were there. They were thousands of miles away. They were paying them to be thousands of miles away, and they get all the work done, come back just to be like, oh, actually, we're going to go a different direction with this.
Not quite up to our mission statement of not pissing off the U.S. government.
Right. It's like, what? Like, oh, I feel for him, because, like, at that moment, it's like I could feel, like, I had the same feeling, my heart sinking through my stomach, being like, oh, what about what about Troy? No, like, it breaks my heart.
Yeah. Yep. It was, yeah, and I think you always have to look at the positive. You
Yeah.
always have to believe there's a positive. I mean, that's the whole.
Well, that's why we're talking about it now, is to get the story out there, to be like, hey, what this man and his team found is truth. Like, just like he said, everything that is in that, conspiracy of silence is what he could prove. So it's like, you take that and, nobody wants to fill in the blanks, of course, but we can anchor in what truth is there.
Yep. Yep.
So,
And like, stuff John DeCamp found, with Kathleen Sorensen and Julie Waters and, all these other Rusty Nelson, and all these other people, who knows, what they were truly doing at all of these parties. But we do know that it's like you said, the core of it is anchored completely in truth. The fact that Alicia Owens, Paul Bonacci, and Troy, I can't ever remember how to pronounce his last name. Bonner. These stories were true, and we talked to the guy who sat there and talked to him. So once again, huge shout out to Tim for coming on Phantom Facts and giving us his take. Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely. Next week, going back to Columbine.
Traveling back to Colorado.
Going back to Colorado, going across the border. We're going to go into SSRIs. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yes, very interesting indeed. Because this all came from Columbine. So I think we wrap up Columbine as neat as we can before going on to our next subject. So, all right. Well,
sounds good.
Thank you, Phantoms, for joining us today. Thanks again to Tim Tate. We'll link the video Conspiracy of Silence as found on YouTube in the show notes on your podcast player and on the uploaded version of this interview coming in a couple days. So be on the lookout for that, or just Google it yourself. Conspiracy of Silence. Follow us on Twitter X, formerly known as Twitter, Phantom Society, at Phantom Society. TikTok, we're on TikTok, and here on YouTube. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
This is the emergency broadcast system. This is not a test. Repeat, this is not a test. This is our advice to the following steps. If exposed, remove the